Well, Donald Trump continues to say the war in Iran will be short, but his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, has been doubling down, saying Tuesday that Tehran would be hit with unprecedented fire. We're going to talk more about the U.S. military strategy in Iran now with Middle East expert Daniel Schneiderman. Thank you so much, Daniel, for taking the time to speak to us live on Paris Direct. We are now in day 12 of this war. Donald Trump saying it'll be over soon. The military operations seem to be intensifying. First of all, how successful would you say this Operation Epic Fury, as it's called, has been so far?
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you and your viewers today. I would say it's been tactically very successful. They've certainly been able to achieve major effects on significant parts of Iran's military might, but strategic success is going to be elusive for the United States in this particular context. As we've heard, the strategic rationale for this war is shifting every other day. And so I think it'll be difficult to judge what strategic success looks like or if the United States is able to achieve it.
Right. So, given all of that, do we have any real idea, or do we think even the Trump administration has a real idea of what the end game is at this point?
Yeah, look, I think you've seen Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth trying to signal that the goals are achieving certain discrete military outcomes, right? Degrading Iran's missile capability, destroying its navy, achieving strategic effects on its nuclear program. And those goals are discrete and theoretically achievable. The problem is that President Trump set the frame for this war from the very beginning as being about regime change. And so I think from an Iranian perspective, they are not going to accept, at least in the short term, the idea that there's a potential off ramp here. Because for them, the goal is the survival of the regime and the imposition of costs on regional neighbors that it perceives as being far too close to the United States. So I don't think this war is going to end anytime soon.
But just how far do you think the U.S. is willing to go? So far, the White House has refused to rule out troop deployment to Iran. Do you think there's any case scenario where we could be seeing boots on the ground in Iran?
Yeah, look, there's been musing about special operations forces going in to secure nuclear material. That's certainly a distinct possibility. I think the reporting is credible based on what I've read. But I think that this administration does understand the political costs of U.S. troops entering Iran for any purpose, right? It would be very hard for them to avoid that being labeled as boots on the ground. And that is something that President Trump and his team want to avoid, and they've made that very clear. It doesn't mean that that's not where we're going, but I think they've tried to avoid it up to this point.
So, if the U.S. strategy at this point does seem to be, from a military standpoint, just an overwhelming military force, what would you say is Iran's strategy at this point?
Yeah, I think it comes down to one word, and that's survival. If the regime survives, if the IRGC's control of the economy and the military survive, that is a victory for them. They can rebuild, rearm, refit, and attempt to move forward. And in fact, that would be a significant negative outcome for the United States because they will have replaced one hardline leader with another hardline leader with no meaningful change in Iran's regional strategy or policy or its stated goal to empower proxies in furtherance of the Iranian Revolution from 1979. And so that's a terrible outcome for U.S. policy, and that the costs imposed on the region and on the global economy will be swift and severe.
So, was this a miscalculation on Trump's part? Did he think the U.S. could get in and out of Iran quickly, similar to what they did in Venezuela?
Yeah, I think that's an apt comparison. It's pretty clear to me that this administration believed, and they've even admitted as much, that they've been surprised by the sort of resolute nature of the military response from the Iranian regime. And this is the problem when you believe that small tactical operations, even in this case, a very large tactical undertaking, can achieve strategic success, and you potentially underestimate your opponent. I mean, I think there are a number of folks out there, myself included, that have been warning about the potential risks associated with this war, the mining of the Strait of Hormuz being one. And so I think that you could certainly characterize this as a strategic miscalculation. It doesn't mean that ultimately the United States couldn't achieve the goal of regime change, but that's going to be a very long and drawn out process. And I'm simply very skeptical that it'll be achieved through an air campaign.
So this war has obviously caused oil prices to skyrocket around the world, particularly in the United States. I mean, what kind of influence could that have on the war? Is the rise in oil prices and gas prices the main pressure on Donald Trump at this moment?
I think it's an important one, and I think the reporting of the after-hours trading on Sunday on CNBC certainly focused minds at the White House and across the U.S. government, because the imposition of those everyday costs on American voters is something that's very real. It's why you've seen the president signaling the potential release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and other significant steps that would make a real potential short-term impact on energy markets. But the long-term fix to the situation is going to be opening the straits and finding a way to de-escalate the conflict, and that seems to be, at minimum, several weeks off.
So, what's the reaction been like there in the U.S. where you are to this war? Americans have historically rallied behind the flag, behind the troops, whenever a president takes the country to war. But the polls these days suggest that that isn't happening this time around.
Yeah, look, I think it's entirely possible that the United States could see the public rally around the war. It depends on the outcome and the consequences of the initial stages. We're still early on in this process, right? As you said, we're 12 days in, and the worst effects haven't been felt here. I think you could see a rising level of discontent as time goes on. But I do think Americans made very clear, and frankly, the president campaigned on this in 2024 on trying to get the United States out of foreign entanglements, particularly in the Middle East. And so this is why they've been so focused on trying to talk about escalating to de-escalate, right? I'm sure there's quiet conversations happening with Iranian services through traditional intermediaries like the Qataris and the Omanis, to try to find off ramps, right? And like I said, the Iranians are not incentivized to de-escalate, but that doesn't mean the United States isn't looking for that opportunity right now.
All right. Well, we'll be keeping an eye on that as the days go by. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. That's Daniel Schneiderman. Thank you.